Collective protest. We have Poe Johnson, who will be presenting on digitized scandal base in the fandom era. Kirsty Park, No Consent Needed, the Ethics of Sharing Embarrassing Content Online in Irish Culture. And Nathan Fisk, who will be looking at When no one is hearing them swear, Internet Safety as Pedagogy of Surveillance. That's all I'm going to say. I'll turn it over to you if you want to go in order we'd like. I will keep you to about 15 minutes, and when you have 5 minutes left, I'll flash this. Take it away.
Okay, so I actually wrote out my talk. So there you have it. My aim today is to raise a few questions rather than to really offer solutions. I think in general that the function of speculative inquiry is to think through problems and not to solve them, and I think that is especially true in the domain of ethics, where the tendency to be prescriptive rather than descriptive is almost irresistible. So I want to resist that tendency. And instead of suggesting what we should be doing, I just want to synthesize some observations that will probably be unsurprising to the audience. I want to talk about two contemporary phenomena, the collectivization of critique and the quantification of value, and the effect that their relationship has on a public practice of critique, and especially on a public practice of minoritarian critique, by which I mean critique that aims to resist or undo the effects of power on a specific group or specific groups of individuals that are understood as being distinct in some way from some kind of abstract concept of a general population. I think the relation of collectivization and quantification in the digital domain has implications for minoritarian critique that may ultimately run counter to its intended aim. And my presentation originates in January of 2014 when an article was published on the website grantland.com that was linked to the suicide of the article's primary informant. Titled Dr. V's Magical Putter, the article was nominally about a revolutionary new golf club that was invented by the titular Dr. Vanderbilt, but actually the article's primary focus was a prurient and exoticizing investigation not into the golf club, but into Dr. Vanderbilt herself, during the course of which the reporter revealed that Dr. V was transsexual and proceeded to invest considerable energy digging up details of her personal life, including romantic investments, personal history, and relationship with her family. Towards the end of the article, the author reveals that Dr. V had committed suicide while the article was being written. The article sparked a significant stirring in the digital echo chamber, generating responses not only on those corners of Twitter and the blogosphere devoted to issues of transsexuality and gender, but also in the mainstream media, with a slew of opinions in the Huffington Post, 2 articles in The Nation, responses from the New Republic and others, and also a formal response from ESPN, with which Grantland is affiliated. And I would like to pause here to apologize to everyone for using the word blogosphere. The tempest over the Grantland article is an example of the first of the 2 phenomena that I mentioned earlier, the collectivization of critique. Among the most crucial changes that the web has brought to publishing and to public speech more generally is a real-time connectivity that is both vertical and horizontal. On the vertical axis, comment sections, trackbacks, @replies, and similar digital tools facilitate direct and often bluntly opinionated responses to published texts. I wouldn't say that these mechanisms have produced a non-hierarchical field of discourse, because despite the best efforts of Foucault and Bout, there's still a pretty clear difference between an author and a commentator, or a commenter. But opinions and authors have access to each other now in a way that's more expansive and a lot more immediate than in the olden days, and that's a capital O and capital D if you're taking notes. On the horizontal level, meanwhile, groups of readers have access not only to authors and publishers, but to each other, and are able to connect with one another directly, to view and to share responses of other readers. Just as articles themselves go viral, responses have started basically going viral as well, with both positive and negative responses expanding geometrically through networks of similarly minded readers. The horizontal collectivity of these reader responses is especially evident in communities based in shared minoritarian identities, of which trans Tumblr, Black Twitter, and feminist Twitter are a few noteworthy examples. Virtually every piece of online writing, which today really just means virtually every piece of writing, is subjected to the fervent scrutiny of a trial by Twitter And in a number of cases, collective online pushback has led to apologies, retractions, and revisions on the part of media outlets, and even to the firing of writers. The outcry surrounding the article about Dr. V eventually solicited an explanatory letter from Grantland.com that was humbled, if not quite apologetic. So that's what I'm calling the collectivization of critique. The other phenomenon, the quantification of value, is considerably more expansive and complex process than the collectivization of critique, and far less a product, I would say, of an immediate technological moment. From a Marxian perspective, the quantification of value in the form of general equivalence is the precondition of capitalism itself. And in recent decades, critical theory has linked quantification with everything from madness to sexual oppression. Loosely and simply, quantification can be defined for my purposes as the substitution of measurable quantities for descriptive qualities as the determinant of value. And again, while quantification is an old and complex process, not originating in technological advances per se, technological advances in recent years have pushed the process forward to a degree previously unthinkable in virtually every field of production and consumption, to the extent that I would suggest the quantification of value is the single most defining hallmark of our contemporary socioeconomic formation. In determining what gets produced and who gets paid to produce it, numbers have come to serve as the primary and in many cases now the only indicator of value. The process is painfully evident in the rapid-fire world of online publishing, where clicks are the writer's primary measure of success, translating into both ad revenue for media outlets and exposure for the author. So when I speak in my title of an economy of exposure or an exposure economy, what I have in mind is this distinctive condition produced at the intersection of these two phenomena, the collectivization of critique and the quantification of value, in which the circulation of information and the value of that information are constantly chasing each other's tails. The exposure economy has transformed the old PR maxim that there's no such thing as bad publicity into a systemic condition in which clicks and page views drive both editorial decisions and the personal success of individual writers. Just as the uproar over Grantland's Dr. V article provides a good example of collective critique, it also provides a very minor but I think indicative example of the quantification of exposure. So this article that I'm talking about went live on January 15th, 2014, which was a Wednesday morning. I first encountered it on Thursday morning the next day, and I'd never heard of this author, so I looked up their Twitter account randomly, and on the morning of Thursday, the 16th of January, that author's Twitter account had 480 followers. The scandal hit the mainstream on Friday afternoon, and proceeded with fairly predictable dynamics throughout the weekend. On Friday evening, the author's Twitter account had reached 1,000 followers, more than doubling, and by Sunday evening, the end of the weekend, the article had more than 2,000 followers, or the author had more than 2,000 Twitter followers. So whatever qualitative after effects the Grantland story may or may not have had, in strictly numeric terms, the individual author's personal platform in the economy of exposure had effectively quadrupled. In an important sense, the uproar had, if not the opposite effect of the one intended, at least a very significant side effect, not necessarily in the interest of the digital protesters. First, the readership of the article itself increased by several orders of magnitude. The number of people exposed to phobic stereotypes and ill-conceived assumptions was exponentially increased, which I think by any measure was not the intent. And in tandem, the website's page counts rose, and with it their revenue, and the author's net worth as a public writer increased not only implicitly but explicitly. To be a little bit fair to this particular writer, I should note that they haven't actually used their Twitter account since this story broke in January, so that's one form of leveraging that they haven't taken advantage of. But I think the numbers still kind of speak for themselves. My aim isn't to argue that collective minoritarian critique is completely futile, but to conceptualize the feedback loop generated by the relation between collective critique and the exposure economy, and to ask at what point the quantitative value of exposure outweighs the qualitative experience of outrage. To put it more bluntly, at what point does it become economically advantageous to piss off individual groups of minoritarian readers in the hopes of provoking a firestorm? The proportion of internet activity that's driven by clickbait makes me worry that the answer to the question is very soon, if not already. The example I gave earlier focused on a writer's Twitter account, But I think the pressing concern is less the reputation of individual writers and more the potential for unscrupulous editorial policies that throw interchangeable writers under the bus of collective outrage in order to churn out pieces just offensive enough to reliably initiate viral exposure. This potential state of affairs becomes especially credible when we consider the fact that as the CEO of Chartbeat, which is a web traffic tracking company, as the CEO of Chartbeat observed on Twitter a couple of months ago, there's virtually no correlation between how widely someone shares an article and how much time they actually spend reading it. To anyone who has observed more than one or two minoritarian outrage cycles on social media, it's fairly evident that the process has become effectively automated. I should say at this point that I'm not making these observations with a dismissive air, but actually a frankly regretful one. My own intellectual history is rooted in the same kind of identity-based theory and praxis that grounds the digital minoritarian critique I'm expressing doubt about. But it remains the case that in an economic formation in which any response has inherent value, predictability might be the single greatest enemy of a reparative or resistive critique. Since I'm low on time and short on solutions, I want to wrap up the last few minutes by clarifying the questions that these issues raise for me in a preliminary attempt to map out the terrain of inquiry. So the first question I would ask is, how do we activate and sustain an ethic of responsible critique in the exposure economy without disproportionately rewarding the media outlets that we're nominally bringing to task? What strategies of collective redress could digital connectivity facilitate that circumvent the transformation of ethical, qualitative, and aesthetic judgments into purely quantitative value? The second question is, who is the necessary addressee of minoritarian critique? The kind of critique that I've been talking about, for better and for worse, is rooted in a praxis of identity politics that took for granted the erasure of minority interests as a crucial component of systemic oppression. Exemplified by gay activists' now infamous chant, "We're here, we're queer, get used to it," the pre-digital political practice assumes a triangulation in which a political action is addressed to mechanisms of power, but witnessed by a presumed general populace tasked with the implicit adjudication of injustice. Making visible was a crucial element in the struggle of identity politics, not least because as recently as 15 years ago, there was still such a thing as mainstream media. And that mainstream was rigidly oriented to normative standards. In that media culture, the eruption of minoritarian interests into a cultural space necessitated a kind of genuine critical mass that I don't think is really strictly necessary anymore. What is in question at the moment is not the necessity of reparative social justice, but the efficacy of specific mechanisms of redress. And I wonder whether the publicness of a minoritarian investment is as crucial as it used to be. So again, who does such a critique need to address? Other than creating a secondary industry of quasi-professional, if largely unpaid commentators, what is the effective surplus value of conducting minoritarian critique in an explicitly public fashion? And then the third and last question emerges directly from this second question, namely, when every collective critique leaves a clearly visible quantitative trail, can we conceive of an invisible practice of minoritarian activism? I wonder what corrective strategies might be imagined to circumvent the click-counting mechanisms of digital tracking. What would a non-searchable, unquotable minoritarian practice look like? For example, could we conceive of a digital social platform that facilitates communication between members of a particular group that's not necessarily visible to those outside of that group? And can we imagine a practice in which critique is delivered to the recipient, for example, a publication guilty of gross insensitivity, without traveling first through the incendiary domain of the commentariat? Finally, and most simply, is there an effective way to perform critique that doesn't route that critique through its own object by quoting or correcting without linking, for example, or without naming the actual target of criticism? In the absence of recommendations and answers, I want to conclude with a brief self-reflection by observing that when I claim in my presentation to identify a cluster of ethical problems in the terrain of digital social justice critique, my recognition of these phenomena as problematic is itself contingent on the same outmoded conceptions of social justice that predate the exposure economy. When I suggest that social justice critique is easily incorporated into the digital economy of authorship without driving systematic change, or when I suggest that the quantitative reward of being critiqued is antithetical to the project of the criticism itself, my arguments are in turn rooted in the same set of pre-digital practices that drive the frequently derided phenomenon of digital social justice. My critique of the critique, in other words, is itself rooted in a set of qualitative ethical distinctions, fundamentally incommensurate with an economy of pure quantities. So maybe the real question is not whether minoritarian critical investments can be modified to align with the economy of exposure, but far more broadly, what concept of minoritarian ethics would be adequate to a fundamental systemic condition of quantification. Thank you.
So we'll have about 15 minutes at the end for questions and answers, but we'll keep moving. So, Christy, or whoever was. Welcome, Pavel.
Hi, my name is Poe Johnson, and my paper is Digitized Skin Race in the Fandom Era. All right, so critical race theory and fandom studies, let's sort of just get it out of the way. These two concepts don't often go together. You don't often see race and fandom really discussed together, and that's part of what I'm going to be doing today. So, in the beginning, critical race theory, some 70 years ago, excelled in explaining how the encounters between race and the judicial system, race and the educational system, and race and media representations have led to a society that positions people of color through a vast number of cultural codes and systems into subordinate roles. On the other hand, and it's not as short a history as you might think, fandom studies examine how spectators of media texts have found and lost identity, community, and purpose through the discussion, sharing, and reconstruction of media texts. What has seldom, if ever, been thoroughly studied is the way that digital cultures on the internet have brought these two somewhat maligned fields of study together. That's what I hope to do with critical fandom studies. Critical fandom studies suggest that fandoms, rather than emancipate the fan from an ideologically closed text, as has often been suggested and sometimes contrasted, augments the cultural codes of society that CRT warns us against by positioning marginalized groups into minstrel-like positions through the adoption of a supposedly post-racial, post-gender, and post-class lens. So, media fandoms and Web 2.0 applications, when they sort of found each other, it was like a match made in heaven. They're like soulmates. For fandoms, no longer were they had to be stuck or free, if you want to think of it in those terms, to go unnoticed in an underseen sea of mailing lists, zines, and hidden conventions. In the last 10 years, fandom has taken over the media and digital landscape. Seemingly, everyone has come out of the closet and revealed their inner geek or basked in the glory of their secret ship. Canonical text and canonical text can stand side by side in, let's be kind and say, mutual glory. And while 2.0 web applications gave fandoms the agency to become public, its most prominent addition is that it increased our understanding of what a text is, and therefore what a fandom could fandomize. So before we begin sort of earnest about that, we have to understand a couple things first. Hollywood has used the concept of the real lives of celebrities as inspiration for fandom for almost a century. And I cannot put like larger quotes around the concept of real, right? But however, it is not until recently that we've seen full-blown fandoms constructed out of people that have not overtly courted fame. In this way, fandoms and digital cultures have combined to make everyone into a potential text. We are all mediated, and therefore any one of us can have a fandom. However, what we see when we look at the fandom realities of people of color is that in this case, black people are not remediated into images, videos, and fictional texts, or memes that would seem consistent in a so-called post-racial society. Instead, black people are represented in ways that commodify them as damaged goods, or as a representative of all black people, even by other black people. Thus, black people are depicted by fandom utterances as property. Using the fandom content created following the Rachel Gentile testimony in the George Zimmerman trial as a case study, I'm going to talk about how the discourse surrounding fan culture situates and commodifies the mediated black body as property. So one thing we have to understand is that fandom requires a participation level that runs contrary to racism. Fandom needs avid producers, readers, and discussers of her text to even exist. On the other hand, because America is a white supremacist capitalist patriarchy, so shout out to bell hooks, that has spread its ideology throughout 2 centuries of mass-mediated objects, which have interpolated the Africanist presence as inferior. To another shout out to Toni Morrison. Racism flourishes absent the need of overt racists. So while finding racist or racism on the internet is no difficult task, the point of this discussion is not to point fingers at obvious racism, although I will be doing a fair bit of that. Rather, I seek to find the moments where participation and race meet to unveil the unconscious way in which racialized conversations commodify the black body. Digital cultures create a space for the encounter between race and fandom. As stated previously, American media texts have historically been a useful site for the proliferation of racialized discourse and stereotypes. When fans implement tools, media tools to decontextualize canonical text, the events, characters, and settings within an authorized canonical universe, they recontextualize them into fan text like fan fiction, fan videos, blogs, Tumblrs, Twitter, role plays, and more. And when they do this, they run the risk of unconsciously restating media and cultural representations of people of color. It does not matter if these representations are positive or negative. Two-dimensionality is the enemy of understanding. But in truth, anyone who consumes popular media potentially participates in a system that marginalizes minorities into stereotyped obscurity, or worse yet, as a commodity, as property. The unfortunate fact remains that with untamed frequency, a minority's character sole function in a narrative, in a fictional narrative, is a tool to fulfill the main white character's will. Often, minority characters exist without any agency of their own. With this lack of agency combined with historicized characterizations that situate blackness as property, the results are startling. While fandoms can produce horrifyingly ugly representations, even when they seem to tacitly support a black person, they still potentially reinforce racialized paternalism. Both ends of this ideological spectrum traffic in a discourse that others the black body as commodity and as property. But it shouldn't be noted here that this is not just about how white people treat black people within fandom. Because when African Americans attack Rachel Gentile's language and diction, they perform an act of respectability politics that has been common within the black community for centuries. However, in the digital culture, these conversations take on a new significance because they circulate within an intertextual universe. While various ethnicities insulted Gentile in similar ways, the space where the attacks came from differed. From the perspective of those black people insulting her, Gentile's performance somehow stigmatized all blackness as inferior. These fandom utterances do more than just regurgitate a position that allows for blackness to be personified in a single individual. They situate blackness as the site for a fight for whiteness. Thus, Rachel Gentile would have needed to be acceptable to white people in order to successfully represent her race. In doing so, black fandom discussers or creators, like in this meme, infer that the individual racial body somehow exists as part of a larger racialized corpus, which should be moving towards whiteness and alienating what has been cultural blackness. This reduces the fandomized black body to a product of the perceived mediated white imagination. While in truth, the dominant culture does not have a singular interpretation of the black body, and announcing that they do, some black people participate in a vicious racialized circle in which reality reconstructs imagination, or constructs imagination which reconstructs reality. Fandom takes this one step further by deconstructing the reconstructed reality and reconstructing it into an abrasively racist depictions. Both the creators and discussers within the Gentile fandom commodify Miss Gentile's body by engaging in a discourse that places her body as a possession. When a meme creator manipulates an image of Miss Gentile and inserts text of exaggerated speech next to her, they digitally possess her body through a racialized discourse that perpetuates historical depictions of mediated black bodies, once seen in minstrel shows or old, early 20th century films. These images commodify Miss Gentile by policing her performance as essentially black. In this sense, these images do not just commodify Miss Gentile, but all cultural representations of blackness. By mocking along these lines, these meme creators and those that spread the meme tap into historical understandings of blackness that naturalize black performance as inferior to whiteness. On the other end of the spectrum, when a discusser writes a blog post about why white people cannot possibly understand Rachel Gentile, that discusser is not being wholly supportive of Miss Gentile, but asserting their dominance over her body by reconfiguring it to meet their own particular needs. In essence, they claim ownership of her by constructing it in textual terms. While this is true for anyone whose digitized body is taken by a fandom, it is particularly true for black people like Rachel Gentile or Charles Ramsey or Antoine Dotson, to name a few. These individuals incidentally rise to fame and then are racially commodified because of it. Digital networks that construct fandoms out of people that, at least initially, do not seek out fame, traffic on the identity of individuals that do not offer consent. Fandoms measure, tag, and codify these bodies and turns them into racial tropes in order to denigrate them. So when I say that fandom commodifies the black mediated body into property, I mean that fandom understands blackness as an object that can be bartered and sold against a cultural idea bank. Rachel Gentile is just one of those objects and is subsequently subject to the same manner of degradation as an insolent pet or a slave. While fandomized bodies of all types are often ridiculed in digital networks, there is a stark difference in how different races are treated. If you compare Rachel Gentile's fandom to someone like government whistleblower Edward Snowden's, you see the evidence that racism has on canonical connotations. While Snowden is loved and criticized in almost equal measure, his whiteness rarely, if ever, becomes a factor in the construction of his fandom identity. On the other hand, regardless of the philosophical leanings, all discussions surrounding Rachel Gentile inevitably fall on her race, including this one. Blackness is stigmatized as other, even from within. This stigmatization does not end with those that are incidentally famous, but extends to public figures as well. Now, while this discussion has centered around the way that fandoms reconstruct the black body in linguistic and visual discourses that signify it as property, it might be more accurate to say that fandoms reconstruct the black body as an object that can serve a variety of commodified functions, one of which is property. While fandoms may, at times, treat gender and sexual identities with more care, that does not mean these identities are decommodified, but rather they are inscribed with a layer of determinate energy, but that gives them an agency that the black body within fandom does not have. This is the very thing that critical fandom studies hopes to understand. All bodies are under constant negotiation in fandom spaces. Still, while these spaces at times offer chances to subvert gender and sexual normative identities, racial identities of all sorts do not have the same opportunities. In this instance, blacks and whites share in designating black people as other by insisting that blackness ought to reach the same level as whiteness. Whiteness is a myth, but it's only people of color that fall to earth when their wings kiss the sun. This has a larger impact on the socialization of this country moving forward. Fandom might very well be, maybe in fact already is, the voice of the post-millennial subject. Black kids, brown kids, white kids, and other may all understand the black body as a site of access, not agency. Trayvon Martin, Jordan Davis, Jonathan Farrell, and Renisha McBride already exemplify a world in which black life is considered something to be discarded. Fandom potentially highlights this problem, or maybe even augments this condition. Thank you.
Okay, I think I'll stand over here for this. So today I'm going to be presenting on No Consent Needed, the ethics of sharing embarrassing content online in Irish culture. The picture that's on the screen at the moment is the first picture that was uploaded to a Facebook page called Embarrassing Irish Nightlife Photos. The page this is that all I'm going to show of it, which is really good, I can't show it. As you can see, the whole point is to share people's embarrassing moments. Most of them revolve around being drunk, so it can be anything from people who've forgotten where they are and engaging in public sex in a nightclub. It could be people who have gotten very drunk and have maybe lost control of certain bodily functions. It can be nudity. It's, kind of covers the whole spectrum of just sort of moments that if you were to look back, you'd probably say, oh God, what did I do last night? And so that's really the whole point of what I'm getting at, is that I looked at a lot of this and thought, why is this so popular? Because it has become really popular. For example, this page has 168,000 likes. And that's pretty significant when you consider how small Ireland is. It's not that big a country. And the main kind of demographic for those likes as well is 18 to 35-year-olds. Even from my own friends, if I go onto this page, there's 12 of my friends who like this page. And so it gets to be an issue then as well of, a lot of these images are shared without consent. A lot of them, you'll see that they're sneakily taken, and when people aren't looking, they obviously don't realise that these pictures have been taken. And then what can happen next is, it goes online and somebody spots it and, perhaps tags you, perhaps knows you. Either way, there's this whole thing that goes on of why are people sharing it? Why do people enjoy it? Okay. And here's some of the comments that kind of describe the way that people sort of respond to this. So let's see, if you want to act like a tramp in a nightclub in the year 2012 when every phone has a camera, you can expect to be photographed. If you want to act like a tramp, do it in the privacy of your own home and then take a picture there and post it here anyway. Maybe they should behave whilst out and think of this as a lesson and reminder not to do it again. No idea, but it's probably people giving out saying they want to take them down, etc., etc. At the end of the day, it's pages like these that are keeping Facebook going, because it would be so boring without pages like these, let's be honest. And I love this page. As long as I'm there in one of the photos, keep them coming. And I think this is a great kind of concept of what we're sort of looking at here. It's an idea called mediated voyeurism by Faith Halbert. And this quote says, the consumption of revealing images of and information about others' apparently real and unguarded lives, often yet not always for the purposes of entertainment, but frequently at the expense of privacy and discourse through the means of mass media and the internet. And there's a whole kind of spectrum of mediated voyeurism. You could take it from the sort of, I suppose, creepier side of creep shots and jailbait, the whole idea of sneakily taking photos of people in public places. The whole point with that, of course, is that they're not supposed to know that they've been photographed. There's a lot of these as well, exposed, embarrassing, spotted. These have kind of popped up, I know, a lot all over the UK and Ireland, a lot of regional places. And it's the same kind of idea. So, for example, there's this spotted page at the town where I used to go to my school. And that spotted page is just for the small kind of college community, but it'll put things up. It could be as simple as, to the girl in the red jacket who's in the library at the moment, I think you're hot. It obviously gets a lot more sexually suggestive and aggressive than that, unfortunately. But it could even be, a picture uploaded of two girls walking home, and did you see these two on their walk of shame this morning? And then, of course, even to the sort of milder side, you could say that Facebook stalking is the same type of thing. Obviously, a lot less scary. And then, as well, you could even argue perhaps reality TV and talk shows along the same line, although you could say that people do consent to that. Either way, the whole point is kind of, you're seeing what you're not supposed to see. The whole enjoyment of it is these are people's candid moments, these are things we're not supposed to be getting insight into. And one case that really just sort of blew this up in Ireland was the case of Slane Girl. And what happened was, there was a 17-year-old who was from a small town of 4,000 people. If you remember that, it makes this whole story a whole lot worse as well. She was from a small town, she didn't really drink a lot, but she was going to an M&M concert. And she decided to start drinking early in the day. So by the time she got to the concert, she was pretty out of it. And what happened was, she was photographed. The bottom half of this picture is of her performing oral sex on this man. And there was another picture as well for performing oral sex and someone else, and a few different pictures. And what happened is it turned into a huge media frenzy. The images started to go viral, they started to be shared. At one point, Slain Girl was trending globally, which is kind of staggering. And here's some of the sort of talk that was going on about it. Slain Girl, oh fuck, ultimate fear. Some girls have no respect for themselves. Have absolutely zero sympathy for the slain girl, her own fault for doing it in public. Slain Girl is a fucking slut. I can't believe so many feminist piece of trash are defending that bitch. So obviously some really misogynist talk, some, yeah, quite scary stuff. And what got interesting about this too, yeah, it started to get into memes and stuff like that. And this was all over Facebook, it was all over Twitter, it was on the radio, it became a thing in the news. And part of why was because all of a sudden, when they went onto her Instagram, it said that she was 16. So all of a sudden there was a problem of, hold on a second, have large quantities of the country accidentally been sharing child porn? What's what's going to happen with this? And so all of a sudden you have people starting to delete their tweets, delete their photos, and there's different social media companies were taking action against it as well. I think this is hilarious, people complaining that if their Instagram has gotten deleted because of Slain Girl. Later it turned out that she was actually 17, but as the case came out, it got more and more complex. For example, it emerged that while she was at the concert, she had reported that she'd been sexually assaulted, and then as well, she was after this, her name was put out online. She became sort of, you know, people knew who she was, and like I said, she was from a very small town, so she ended up in the hospital being treated for shock as a result of all of this. So really huge ramifications from what started as this thing she did at the concert, which in fairness probably wasn't a very sensible thing to do, but it blew into pretty huge proportions. And it wasn't all bad, I have to say. There were people who promoted this hashtag Slain Girl Solidarity, and these were some of the tweets. Change my name to Slain Girl and Slain Girl Solidarity. Can't begin to imagine how many headlines I'd make if all my doings were broadcast. What's with all the Slain Girl tweets? Young and drunk, made a mistake. What about Slain Boy? And that's a whole other topic as well. And the only mistake Slain Girl made was not remembering that many Irish people are misogynist tosspots, which is probably true. And call me old-fashioned, but can't everybody involved in this Slain Girl scandal be in the wrong? Boy, girl, photographer, and sharer. So people started to say, hold on a second, you know, let's look at this a bit wider. Is this all about this one girl and her mistake, or does this go a bit wider? What about the people taking the photos? What about the people sharing the photos? What about all of that? And that's what really kind of captured my interest in this. It was a question of why did people capture embarrassing content? Why, when somebody saw that happening, was there an instinct to, you know, take a snapshot and upload it? Why did they share it? Why did they enjoy it? Why is that something that people feel it's okay to consume and okay to gain enjoyment from? And so, trying to answer that question brought me on to looking at what is privacy. And this is sort of my, I suppose, this is my argument for why I think people don't have an issue with it. And this is sort of the traditional idea of privacy, the selective control of access to the self, to control, edit, manage and delete information about themselves, and decide when, how and to what extent information is communicated to others. And it's very much, it revolves around control, around boundaries, around the sort of binary idea of things are either private or they're not private. And that's for a long time been the sort of traditional concept of privacy. But what I think is interesting is that you start to see this a lot more people kind of saying, does that really fit now? Does that really make sense in the context that we're in? And what I think it comes down to is actually more about the social value of privacy, about the norms that we create around privacy. And I love this quote from Helen Nissenbaum. It says, "We have a right to privacy, but it's neither a right to control personal information nor a right to have access to this information restricted. Instead, it's a right to live in a world in which our expectations about the flow of personal information are, for the most part, met." And that brings it back down to expectations. What are our expectations? For example, you know, if you're at a concert and you're very drunk, do you reasonably expect that that's going to turn into a global phenomenon? Perhaps not. And also it comes down to ethics as well. What do we expect of each other? What do I expect from the people around me? What does that mean in terms of community, in terms of, you know, the social value of privacy? And I think that a lot of it comes down to this, that a lot of our rhetoric around privacy and surveillance discourse kind of comes down to two things. It comes down to, first, companies who store, collect, use data, a lot of things that were talked about in the panel last night. How are people using the information that we've given? Are they using it in ways that are abusive, ways that we haven't consented to? If they are, we have a problem with that. And the second is personal responsibility for yourself. And I think that's a huge one, that a lot of the talk is be careful what you're uploading, make sure your settings are private, make sure that you're acting in a responsible way online, make sure that you're not putting things up that your future employer is going to see and not want to hire you, make sure that you're considering all of these things. And so my kind of analysis of this is that it creates a sort of get out of jail free card when it comes to consent. Because when it comes to the internet, what we generally say is, if you put it online, then it's fair game. Expect the worst. If you put up a picture of you drunk and your employer sees it, that's your own problem. You should have known that, you should have expected it, you should have anticipated that, and by choosing to upload it, you've basically given your consent to that. But what I see as a big problem with this is digital dualism. Because if you look at this and this, they're two very different things. And I love the way this is worded on the left. It's the settings, privacy settings on Facebook, profile information, control who can see your profile, control who can contact you, control what information is available. It's all about controlling what you're putting up. But then you have this on the right. These four people who all have the capability to capture a moment that you're in, and you have no control around it. There is no possible way that you can control what's happening on the right. And so this idea that public is everywhere kind of changes this, let me skip this slide. Oh, there we go. Kind of changes this idea of consent, because it goes from, if you put it online, then it's fair game. If you do it in public, then it's fair game. If you do it at all, then it's fair game. Because the whole reasoning comes back to that there isn't this simple online-offline divide. What you're doing, you're giving your consent by the act of being in public. By the act of performing at all, you're giving your consent. I don't know what way I've done these slides. Yeah, and I think that it comes down to this as well. None of us expect to be under constant surveillance in public, but when violations of what we expect happen, the reaction is, you should have known better because you're under constant surveillance in public. And that sums it up. Have absolutely zero sympathy for slaying girl who won't fault for doing it in public. So mediated voyeurism is based on the idea that your acts in public, and sometimes even not in public, are acts of exhibitionism, and they legitimize any voyeuristic interest. So, to kind of finish up, what are the ethics of mediated voyeurism? Why do people feel it's okay? And I think it comes down to this, that it's a surveillance society logic without the corresponding leap in understanding what that means on a societal level. It's when we have this attitude of you've nothing to fear, you've nothing to hide, we apply that on a mass scale. And for me, what I think this is worrying is, what does this mean? What does this mean in terms of just a collective how we are together? What does this mean in terms of trust, in terms of community? And I think this sums it up really well. Slaying girl, oh fuck, ultimate fear. What does it mean if we're expecting 13, 14, 15-year-olds to not only be aware of how they are in their own spaces and within families and everything else, but expecting them to consider and expect the worst and anticipate how their actions in public could potentially be used in any way? Yeah.
All right, again, oh, wait a second.
Did you lose your screen?
There we go. All right, again, I'm Nate Fisk. I've been studying youth and the internet for about a decade now, focusing specifically on ideas of youth and internet safety. I have a penchant for using quotes from my data as titles for things, and we'll get to where that quote comes from in just a second. But more generally, I'm going to talk a little bit about today, again, youth and internet safety and ideas of how it is that we construct watchers within surveillance systems. And this comes out of some work I did in 2011 on focusing specifically on youth internet safety discourses. And what I wanted to know more about was what kinds of social life that we're constructing for kids and adults with the youth internet safety curricula and policies being developed. And this was a study that took place over the course of about a year. I went into 6 school districts in upstate New York. So we are talking a very specific group of kids and a very specific group of adults in this sense. And we can problematize those concepts all we want as well. But I did it was a survey of students in grades 6 through 12 on each one of these districts, approximately 3,000 students overall. I did focus groups with parents, focus groups with teachers, and then interviews with school administrators, and also a handful of teachers and school resource officers. And this is in addition to an evaluation of, this is the NetSmarts Youth Internet Safety Curricula. Has anyone heard of NetSmarts in here? No, not at all? So NetSmarts, yes, of course, David, you've heard of it. So NetSmarts is probably the dominant youth internet safety curricula provided to kids, at least in New York State and frequently around the US. And that's primarily because it's free. It's also coming from a fairly large source, which is the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. I really like this image too, because they really conveniently just kind of outline all the different groups that I'd like to talk about. So, coming out of this research came a number of things. Probably the biggest, at least, distance from this paper was the idea that youth voices are fundamentally absent from the kinds of curricula and policy that we use to regulate their behavior online. But here, I also started to think a little bit more about, well, statements like this, and this is where my title came from. I think that educating the parent piece is incredibly important. The hard thing is enforcing the parents to participate in that. If someone's not supervising them with this media, it's as good as kids will swear when no one is hearing them swear. Again, I'm keeping the grammatical errors in, and I fear for that. And this statement in particular was really interesting to me. I was like, how do you get to a point where you're talking about, as an adult, kids swearing at each other when there are no adults around, which has probably been going on for an incredibly long period of time, and thinking in your mind, I'm really worried about that now. And not only that, but you're connecting it into issues of internet safety, right? That it's about somehow now something about being on the media. And this is in contrast to statements like this from the student side. This is one of my student survey respondents, and he just simply said, my mom and other adults are always so concerned that my friends or I are doing things that are wrong online because I don't want her meddling. But it's just my private space where I can be a teenager. And I don't know if any of you have read, I'm sure Dana Boyd is a common name here, but her recent piece in the LA Times talks explicitly about these kinds of issues. Just always being easy to punch. Anyway, but one of the things that she brings up is the fact that, well, the social spaces of youth are shrinking. And it's not simply the fact that they are drawn to this media, again, the digital native critique, right? It's not simply that they're drawn to this media by something biological or innate. It's that they have fewer and fewer places within which they can actually communicate with each other outside of adult surveillance in any kind of significant sense. And so what I was curious about was not just the kids, but the adults. How do we get to the adults thinking that, well, this is a particular problem that we need to pay particular attention to? This also comes out of surveillance studies, and I'm going to get to my what conceptual framework here to the extent that I'm going to use one today. This comes out of surveillance studies in that there's been relatively little work done that pays attention to the construction of watchers themselves. We tend in surveillance studies to look very carefully at the kind of subjectivities and identities of those being watched. But there's very little attention paid to those of the watchers themselves. And since a lot of my data was about parents and adults, guardians of youth, well, I thought I'd look into that a little bit more. And in general, what I came up with this idea of pedagogies of surveillance. And I'm not going to go too detailed into the conceptual work here. Briefly, I draw on the work of, there's a call by Gavin Smith in 2012 to focus more carefully on surveillance and action, looking at how surveillance itself is kind of a way of life and a mode of thinking. And also drawing on the work of Jacques Donzelot in The Policing of Families, a 1970s piece. He talks specifically about pedagogies of the family and the way that reconfigured family life. But In general, I'm arguing here that there are these pedagogies of surveillance. You have to learn to become a watcher. You don't just simply exist as one. That becoming a watcher is the obtaining of very specific conceptual frameworks that allow you to interpret data in ways that make it institutionally legitimate. And frequently this happens at the cost of a coextensiveness with a social field. So when you learn to interpret data in that way, you stop doing it in the ways that are natural to you, or at least part of your everyday social life. Further, it's not just about data per se, it's not just about reading data in a particular way. It's also about learning how to approach specific forms of technologies as surveillance tools. So we can think of the ways in which a particular watcher is socially constructed, and additionally how they socially construct technologies themselves. So I'm going to start out by talking a little bit about the construction of the trusted adult. And this is coming out of the actual curricula provided to adults. And this 90% of the time happens either as they go online and look at the material on their own, but more frequently, at least in terms of the way that these kind of assemblages come together, plays out in the way that schools provide this material to parents. So typically you have something along the lines of a presenter coming in and providing these kinds of material to parents, right? And it happens in this way that, of course, the school has an interest in teaching parents about these issues because they are also part of this equation. And in NetSmarts, there is this figure of the trusted adult, right? They are the point of contact for youth when they are in any kind of distress online, and youth are encouraged to have trusted adults in their lives that they can go to and talk about these kinds of issues. Now, from the category of trusted adult, youth are explicitly excluded from that category, right? They are not allowed to, and the rationale for that being that if kids talk to other kids about